here, so welcome to the bank. I know that you have your monthly luncheons here, and so many of you, it's not the first time, but for some folks it might be. So we're really pleased to have you here and to have you here today. So Jerry referenced Chicago. So where's the other Chicago people? All right. I've been trying to figure out how to get the good, better, best, never let it rest as a chant up on the 9th floor. So my colleagues here are going to help me with that because I think we need to bring that on home. And God willing, we'll play another game after next weekend. Okay. So let me grab this. As I put the slides up, I'll tell you the most important thing that I need to say. 14-character passwords are kind of a pain in the neck. Okay. So the most important thing is what's at the bottom here, right? These are my views and my views alone. They do not represent the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta or the Federal Reserve System. We've got some time here today, I guess roughly 45 minutes or so. And I want to touch really on what's most important and most of interest to all of you. So what I plan to do is talk a little bit about the economic outlook and how we're kind of seeing things as we ramp up into the last week and a half or so before Raphael goes to the FOMC meeting. Probably no surprise to folks in this room, we're going to pick up right where we left off. So you're probably not going to hear a lot of new things from me. And that's why I do want to make this a little more expansive than maybe we might typically do with just an open outlook talk. So I've got some questions in here for all of you. So I hope that you'll all participate, raise your hands. From whatever seat you sit in, we're interested in hearing what your views are on what is, quite frankly, a really challenging, yet for all of us in economics, fascinating situation that we find ourselves in. So we're going to do that. And then I want to make sure there's time for questions. There's a lot of news lately, most of it that I'm not, sort of directly going to talk about, but happy to answer your questions. So if you want to ask questions about the presidential search and kind of what that means for the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta or the system, happy to do that. I think, we're all well aware that the chair put out a video statement on Sunday night. I would refer you to the chair's video statement for any comments on that, but we can talk about Fed independence writ large and just kind of how everyone's thinking about the role of the Federal Reserve in the financial system and in the economy as a whole. So again, would love to hear your views back on all of those things too. So nothing, don't shy away from asking a question. I've handled a lot and so everything is sort of inbounds. And if it's not, then we just, we won't talk about it, but that's fine. We'll figure it out as we go along. Okay. So we're going to pick up right where we left off, and I'm just going to give you kind of a brief tour of kind of how we're seeing things at the staff level here in Atlanta on economic growth, sort of kind of what's happened a little bit through the fall, what do we kind of see going forward, where the FOMC is on that, look a little bit at labor markets, a little bit at inflation, and then really get to the core of the matter, which is how do you navigate through this environment to balance the risks to the dual mandate? And so again, I'm going to be stopping at certain times and asking for all of you to tell me what you think, and maybe even engage in a little mental imagery. If you were Raphael sitting at that table at the end of January, what would your position be? And what do you think is most important to be thinking about in a risk management sense as the committee kind of guides us forward? Okay, so in terms of real GDP growth, this slide and all the slides obviously are going to be colored by the fact that the data is not where we would usually find it, meaning some of it doesn't exist. So there were certain surveys and other things that the BEA and the BLS and census were unable to do during the government shutdown. So those data points are just missing. Other data points, are sort of, I would say, affected by that government shutdown. So we'll get to a little bit of that on prices. So including the calculations that go into the CPI. When there isn't data there, there's sort of an imputation, or the BLS has moved into using older data, September data, to substitute for October data. And so we can get a whole lot of wonkiness in the data. And that's part of what makes it challenging right now. So what you see here is sort of the actual path of GDP growth over the past several years, where the blue chip economic estimate of private forecasters is for the fourth quarter of 2025. And then the green bars over here at the end are the median predictions from the FOMC at their December meeting, right? So this, if you want to think of it this way, this is sort of some summary statistic that tells you where at least sort of the middle of the FOMC is on what they see for growth going forward. You notice the 2025 numbers are all over the place, right? So at the beginning of the year, a lot of this was tariff related. So it was really big net imports to get ahead of tariffs, and so we were seeing the lower growth in 2025. Then we had some of that bounce back. If any of you have looked at GDP Now lately, you will see that the Q4 number is a lot higher than what we see here for blue chip. Went up and talked to our expert, Pat Higgins, who developed GDP Now, and he talked to me about all of the changes because of the data issues that are happening at the BEA in terms of getting that number right. So he fully expects this to be changing as we get some more data. There's going to be a print today as well, a new update to GDP Now. That he's had to actually work on a little harder because, again, with the shutdown, the data's not coming in exactly the ways we would feed it straight into a model and then get a number out. So his advice to me and our advice to all of you, and I think you probably are already in this position, take all this with a grain of salt and try to look through a lot of numbers, smooth them out, and really sort of focus on what are you seeing on the ground in other kinds of data sources, whether it's anecdotal or supplementary or out of the private sector, that pieces together a puzzle of where economic growth is. But off of this picture, you see, at least the FOMC thinks, that a reasonable growth rate, maybe even a little bit higher than potential, which is at 1.8 for the long run, is likely going forward into 2026 and 2027 and 2028. So they don't see any real side weakness there. Doesn't mean it couldn't happen, doesn't mean we don't think about it and worry about it, but it's not in sort of, if you will, a baseline forecast. If we kind of parse the GDP numbers a little bit and we only look here at final sales to private domestic purchasers, so we take out the inventories, the net imports, and all the government stuff, you see a much cleaner picture in some sense. So you've still got a little bit of volatility over the course of the year, Q1 coming in a little weaker, 2 and 3 a little higher, but you don't see that level of variability. So you might think of this as maybe a better indicator of aggregate demand. So how strong is the demand coming from the housing sector, and the business sector, and the consumer sector, in terms of demand growth and economic activity. So this is one way to kind of do that. And this would, of course, include all the AI investment and other things that we've heard a lot about in the news. Okay, so it looks like there's some kind of solid growth coming here. This is the first time I want to turn it around on you and ask, what's the view from your seat? So when you hear that, when you think about where we've been this year, with all of the uncertainty, with some new legislation in place that we hear from some contexts is likely to influence business decisions and activity, potentially really to the upside and be tailwinds to growth. How do you see 2026? So we'll just do it with raise your hand. And again, I want this from whatever seat you sit in. And think about the national economy, just say kind of what's your best guess at an expectation? So what is your best guess on the forecast for economic activity or demand growth in 2026 compared to this year? So how many people think it's likely to be slower? How many people think it's likely to be the same? Okay. And how many people think it's likely to be stronger?
How much stronger?
I don't know, you tell me. I mean, these are my follow-up questions. So
manufacturing is slowing.
Yeah.
Private consumer is slowing. This sector is slowing. But that's the AI a
Mm-hmm.
How much does that continue to contribute to offset the rest?
That's a big question for us. I mean, you hear all the things, right? So we hear from energy companies and commercial construction companies about all of the activity that's going and the pipelines that they have out for several years, but also you look at the equity markets and you hear words like bubble and, is the promise really there? And then also you think about the timeline and how long is it going to take for all of that, if you want to think of it as investment capacity, to come and turn into productivity benefiting activities. How fast is AI getting involved in actual integrated business processes at your firms or other firms out there? Okay, so what I saw was mostly about the same. And I will tell you that's roughly consistent with what we hear from most of our business contacts, that things are not poised to ramp up in a huge way. They're also really not, they're not necessarily that concerned about significant slowing. So what do you think the biggest risk to growth would be then, looking at 2026? The Fed, great. Fantastic. Yeah.
Is there loss of confidence that is the biggest risk? Could be directed in multiple directions, whether that's AI investment or consumer confidence, right? Economics.
Mm-hmm.
But my view is that we could theoretically keep some methods that might be a bit hyperinflationary wouldn't be able to do previously. But now we have this new factor, AI, that might be deflationary at some point. It's a thin line to balance, I think. What do you think?
We think so too. It's very tricky. I think what I'll sort of tell you a little bit about what I've heard over the past couple of days is I've talked to some folks getting ready for other conferences and that I'm going to moderate with business makers, business leaders and panels. I'm hearing a lot that over the last 18 months, AI has gone from something that's sort of conceptual, we're interested, we're experimenting, we're trying, we're doing some things, to now it's becoming more fully integrated. And now firms are actually pushing to incent and to move on AI incorporation in their businesses. So it's no longer, maybe it's coming, maybe it'll work, how do we deal with the risks? And these may be, the ones I talked to were particularly innovative firms. But that's something that we're interested in is what's the pace of adoption and how are firms and organizations thinking about how to get the most out of that AI benefit over the short term, but then also sort of over the more medium to longer terms. So we'll be watching productivity pretty quickly. Right now, it's been higher than it has been in the past. AI would be a structural change. And so part of the challenge for monetary policy is how do you think about something that's happening structurally in the economy relative to monetary policy, which is really a tool for dealing with cyclical fluctuations, right, to achieve that dual mandate. So that's a part of our discussions upstairs is how actually even do we take AI on board as we see more firms adopting it and as we see the impact, whether it's on labor markets or on economic activity, startups, and other kinds of things. Okay, I'm super curious about this. Does anyone in here see regulation and legislative changes as creating a tailwind for growth going forward into 2026? We hear a lot about the effects, potential effects on investment, but haven't heard a lot necessarily that I would say meat on the bones of that observation. So I'm curious, does anyone in here have thoughts about whether or not that will actually be, I would say, a significant tailwind to economic growth? Yeah.
Maybe a little bit of a crazy take, I don't know. But, like capping credit cards at 10% might be like for the next 3 months, might be good, but then there'll be like some reduced lending. But I'm curious about the tailwinds effect of that. So it means that some new lenders might pop up and say, we might give a bit more, give a bit more lending capacity, but therefore might sell some interesting data that is like generated and make the spending easier, which allows other businesses to make more intelligent investment decisions, which ultimately might be good.
So you're thinking very broadly like an economist here. So we see the first order effects of the policy, the second order effects, the hypotheses about the third and fourth order effects, right? And everything's endogenous, which is what makes this so much fun. And it seems as though every day, right, there's a policy proposal on a social media channel or elsewhere that makes it, kind of difficult to parse through. Typically, we look at the ones that have already been through Congress or enacted and try to understand how businesses are going to be affected by them. So in this particular case, it's the changes to depreciation and thinking about what that's going to do to investment. And I think mostly what I've heard about in the regulatory side really has to do with like EPA regulations, specifically towards automotive vehicles, but also in the financial sector. So some changes in banking regulations or the stance of regulatory policy. But unclear yet whether those are going to be meaningful enough to move these aggregate numbers. Okay, so now let's go look at the labor market. Again, I don't think I'm telling you here anything that you don't already know. It's been slowing throughout the course of the year. So here you see the 12-month and 3-month moving averages in these total jobs numbers of private payroll. So as we've seen, this declining set of jobs numbers every month, and now we're at levels that, to be quite frank, when I joined the Fed in 2000, or many times since then, if we had seen jobs numbers that were down around 25,000 a month, it would have been a signal of a weakening economy, a very weak labor market. This would have been, call it alarm bells, really, that were screaming. But right now, we find that, the unemployment rate has ticked up, but very, very little over the past 6 months, even as the decline in monthly payroll additions has occurred. So what's the missing puzzle piece? The missing puzzle piece really has to do with labor supply, right? That's a good picture ultimately and is affected by labor demand. It's also being affected by labor supply, especially obviously the unemployment rate, because that's the number of people who are looking for jobs as a fraction of the entire labor force. So oftentimes we look at this as labor force participation. In this particular case, I'm just showing you population growth because the big driver here is not births and deaths. Even though we have a baby boom generation aging out, it really is the net immigration, right? And so what you see here is the massive decline in net immigration this year and predicted forward into next year. That means there's not a lot of labor supply. So as you see these low additions to private payrolls every month, if there are not increases in the people looking for jobs, right, or the people who are in the labor force and able to work, you can see a relatively stable, not very problematic or concerning looking unemployment rate because there's just labor supply. So part of what we talk about in our staff meetings is, does this tell us that the labor market is roughly in balance? So it may mean that we're not growing as fast in terms of jobs in the economy, and that does equate to households and spending power and all of those other things. So it doesn't mean that there's not a concern there. But it does mean that maybe the labor market is not particularly tight or particularly loose. We could be in a place where it's relatively balanced because we really aren't seeing changes in the unemployment rate, right? That, again, feeds into monetary policy because what we're thinking about are what are the cyclical fluctuations that monetary policy could address, right? So we want to know, is the labor market in a place where it's running really hot? Is it in a place where it's really, really slowing and lagging and is going to spill over into disposable income and household consumption? Those are the things that we kind of think about in balance. And in this particular case, we can't do the calculus quite the same way, right? So for us, a lot of the balance means we have to dig deeper. I do want to give you a bit of maybe a benchmark for thinking about how many jobs the economy would need to add per month to keep the unemployment rate steady as it relates to net immigration. So here you've got 3 different potential measures of a net immigration scenario, right? So you've got 3.3 million from the CBO. You then have, then that was their 2024 estimate, so we were still getting a lot of net immigration. You see that drop to 400,000, CBO estimate for September 2025. And then there's an academic paper here that's got a lower estimate. So this is what if actually net immigration is minus about 650,000 workers. On the right-hand side, you see the number of jobs that needed to be added to keep the unemployment rate constant, right? So you look at this and you say, wow, if we're actually losing, in the worst-case scenario, we've got negative 650,000 jobs, or excuse me, net immigration workers being added, we could actually see unemployment not change even if the economy as a whole is losing jobs, right? Because in some sense, you're losing the workers as fast or faster than you're losing the jobs. So just as you see the jobs numbers come in, I think this is a good way to be thinking about exactly how immigration policy is going to play into seeing those numbers. But I'll go back to my prior point. We need to look beyond these numbers because they're, again, not really helping us, right? The unemployment rate itself is not a good summary statistic. Really, it never has been. But in this particular case, it isn't for new reasons, right? It has never been a full indicator of the potential of the economy or how many people we could pull into the labor market if it was more vibrant. But in this particular case, it's just not giving us a signal that it's going to relate very well to future economic activity. So we have this chart on our website. It's called their spider chart. It looks complicated, but just take it as a visual picture, and you can kind of dig into the details later if you'd like. Every one of these sort of little axes out there with a label around it is a different employment indicator from around the labor market. So we've got everything from initial claims numbers for unemployment to the employment cost index growth, which has to do with wages. We've got the employment to population ratio there, which kind of gets at this labor supply. We've got the private quits rate. People quit jobs when they think they can get other jobs. We've got job availability and hiring plans from businesses. These come from surveys, right? So we've got 3 timelines kind of posted here. December of 2009 is sort of the height of a recession. So you can think about this spider chart. If you're in the middle, really close and contracted, that's a very, very slow, sluggish labor market, and it's indicative of sort of low economic activity. So these are the places where we're concerned. If you go out to the sort of perimeter, you're now talking about a booming labor market, right? You're adding a lot of jobs, wages are going up high, people are being pulled into the labor market because they know that they can get jobs. Firms may be saying it's hard for me to find people to get jobs because there are so many jobs out there and not enough people. The green line is December of 2019, so pre-COVID. And if you think about it, pre-COVID was, at that particular time, had a very low unemployment rate in the mid-3s, right? And we've really felt like the job market was very strong. The blue line is where we are right now. So again, as I look across a lot of indicators, not just one, I can kind of benchmark them according to this. Am I seeing real signs and red flags all across the board that we have a very weak labor market? No, that's not really what we're seeing, right? Are we seeing that we've got a very expansive labor market? Well, no, not really. It's not to where it was in 2019, but it's also, again, not necessarily cause for concern, i.e. being on the precipice of a real economic downturn. Okay, so we start to look at all of these pictures, and mostly what we hear from businesses, back to the questions I asked you before, we say, what are you thinking about doing with hiring in 2026? And most people say, we're thinking it's, our payrolls are going to stay relatively flat. We're not really looking to hire a lot. We're not really looking to downsize a lot. Now, of course, that varies by sector, so we can talk about where the booming parts are and where some of the slowing parts are. But roughly speaking, across all of the sectors, we don't see a whole lot of movement in either direction. So it means we're probably going to be looking at data and a labor market that looks like this for a while. And the question is, what signal do you draw from that? Do you say monetary policy should respond to the fact that we've got a slowing job market? Or do you say, hey, there are things going on here, whether it's the structural changes of AI, the uncertainty about the Fed, other things in the mix that say, we don't know, and what does that mean for your policy choice? Does that mean you hold still? Does that mean you act proactively to balance some risk and to get ahead of something? How do you put that into a monetary policy decision? And that's the challenge. Okay, so on inflation, again, not telling you anything that you don't already know, haven't made a lot of progress towards the 2% target in 2025. So this is a picture of 3 different personal consumption expenditure index inflation indices. So the headline PCE, the core, which takes out food and energy, and then something called the Dallas trimmed mean. So you take all of the different sectors across the PCE and you take out the ones that have had the highest price growth and the ones that have the lowest price growth. And so you're sort of hitting the middle of that distribution, right? And you want to kind of see where that is. Well, they're all about the same, and they're all above target. And they've, importantly, stayed above target for most of 2025. So if you hear people on the committee or elsewhere say, well, I'm concerned that we're not making more progress, this is really what's being talked about. There was a lot of progress as the Fed raised interest rates in bringing inflation down across all those measures and any one that we could calculate. But coming into this year, again, with all the churn, including policy, and then again the data, things look a little wonkier. And we have to ask ourselves, well, absent tariffs, would we have seen more progress towards the 2% target? What is the impact? So that's been a lot of our year, is trying to understand those things and pull them apart. Here, what you're seeing is a variety of indicators for inflation expectations 1 year ahead. And you see that by all of these measures, really, and they span firms to households to broader surveys and professional forecasters, all of those are also still sitting above 2% for the next year. So if I think about what people think is happening with inflation over the next year, they're, roughly speaking, in line with the inflation measures that we've seen for the last year. And they say, we're not seeing a whole lot of evidence that there's an expectation of progress. That could be fine, right? They can hang out there for a while. But what if then there becomes an erosion of confidence that inflation will get back to the 2% target, right? The question has to do with the anchoring or the unanchoring of inflation expectations. And that's another part of what a policymaker is going to have to think about as they look forward. Inflation might not be making progress, and that might be okay. And as we ride through the tariff impact, we'll continue to make progress toward 2%, and that's fine, and maybe monetary policy should look through all of that. Or you could say, hey, we still haven't gotten to the place we said we were going to go, right? The committee made a commitment to 2%. We're still not there. What if people begin to think we're not going to get there, and they restart their inflation expectations? I think we heard a little bit before. You could end up with an inflationary dynamic that begins to take over. So how do you kind of think about how likely that risk is? It would certainly be impactful if that were the case and inflation expectations became unanchored. I did want to show you this one. We're moving to the CPI here, but the important part is that while you can see the impact of tariffs in the core goods price growth rates in red very clearly, you're also, and when you look at the blue line, realize that service inflation is not back to where it was pre-COVID. So that's part of what's hanging all of this up, and that tends to be pretty persistent. Okay, so this is clearly not an all tariff story. So as we think about looking through those tariffs, there's still other dynamics going on, and that's really important to take account of. So Daniel's here with our survey center, so we'll showcase some of our wonderful work from that group. We went out and asked CFOs across the country, as you think about price and cost expectations over this past year and over the coming year, how much is tariff driven and how much is non-tariff driven? And so on the left side, you see costs. So most of these CFOs said, yeah, you know what? The tariffs are impacting those cost expectations going forward, but that's not the driver. It's other things. Similarly, as they think about their own price growth, right? This is the prices that we're going to end up seeing in the CPI and the PCE. They're looking at this saying, yeah, okay, well, I'm going to try to pass some of that through. So some of it's going to be tariff related. But there's a whole lot of other stuff going on that may impact those pricing decisions. And if you look at the numbers for 2026 in prices, 2.6 and 2.9 is not equal to, right? And we're hearing that from, again, a lot of firms who were talking about the way that they're looking forward and going to manage. And I think, Daniel can correct me, but I think as we've looked at these kinds of numbers and we've compared them to what actually happens, I think these CFOs have been pretty in the ballpark. Yeah, so we take it seriously because this is not a kind of a fuzzy number that people just kind of throw out there. So this is, again, part of what we want to understand about whether or not, especially with the data that we're getting on inflation, with the effects of the government shutdown being sort of obscuring some of the detail that we might like to dig into, how can we think about the risk going forward? And certainly this seems to show there's something to be concerned about, to be thought about. So put those two things together. There are two risks to the dual mandate, right? So the dual mandate is 2% inflation and maximum employment. You look here and you say, okay, well, one risk is that we're not going to make progress towards the 2% in any reasonable amount of time. This is going to kind of stall out and potentially unanchor inflation expectations, which is then going to create an inflationary tailwind, right? And so we'll just actually at some point be driving even farther away from the 2% target. And potential loss of Fed credibility, period. So those of you that are students of history, you can think back to the 1970s and the early 80s. There was exactly that sort of a response as the labor market started to weaken, then monetary policy eased up a little bit, and then inflation went up, and it went up actually higher than the prior peak, right? Because folks were sort of rethinking, well, where could this go? And the Fed didn't necessarily have the credibility, and ultimately it required Volcker to step on the economy pretty heavily in order to get to a place where we could bring inflation back down. The other risk, of course, is the risk of a further weakening in the labor market such that it is what we normally would think of, meaning the economy, ultimately the jobs are contracting, the economy is contracting, disposable income's contracting, consumers are holding back and they're getting cautious, businesses don't want to expand because they don't think about aggregate demand. All of those things, that could be the other side of the weakness. I've shown you a bunch of data that says it's completely unclear whether the first one's going on. It's completely unclear whether the second one's going on. And so the question that we've been asking all our boards of directors, all our contacts, all our advisory council members, I hope you, as you've been thinking about it, are asking yourselves the same question: which one are you more concerned about going into 2026? And so I'll ask again for a show of hands. I'll put you on the hot seat. You're now a policymaker. Not asking yet what your policy decision is, just saying which one of these is more concerning to you in the current environment as you look forward into 2026. So how many people are more concerned about lack of progress toward a 2% target? Okay. How many people are more concerned about the labor market weakening? You guys are good. The last 6 months, this is exactly what we've seen. The room is almost evenly split across those very two, which makes this policy environment so particularly challenging, right? And it tells you that over the past 6 months, we haven't really made a whole lot of movement in answering that question. Again, part of it is the data, for sure. But part of it is the number of moving pieces, probably. And part of it, as we heard early on, could be, that now sort of Fed behavior is being, is uncertain, or at least not as straightforward. We don't have a period right now of a lot of forward guidance from the committee. So on that point, let's look at the dot plot. So are most people familiar? How many people have seen this? Cool. Okay. So 4 times a year, the FOMC is asked, each FOMC member, all 19 of them are asked to supply their forecasts for economic growth, for unemployment, for inflation, and then they're asked, well, okay, given your forecast for the year, what do you think is the appropriate level for the short-term interest rate at the end of the year? So every dot up here is a person on the FOMC. You don't get to know what person is what dot. We don't even know what person is what dot. We know what person, we know our dot, but we don't necessarily know the other dots. Several committee members will make big speeches, and so you can infer a lot of dots if you want. But here, so the first column is at the end of 2025, right? So they were about to vote. And so what do you see? Well, most of the committee, in these dots right here, let's see, do I have a, oh. Okay, most of these folks here, were in favor of where the committee ended up, right? Which was a 25 basis point cut. But there were, 5 or so up there who were like, no, I don't really want to make that cut. I'd like to keep it where it is, where it landed after the November meeting, right? And we saw 2 dissents in that direction from the voting members of the committee. One dot said, no, I think it should go down even another 25 basis points. And we saw 1 dissent going in that direction, and that person fully revealed themselves. So that's no longer unclear. But as you look forward, you're seeing sort of even more, right, heterogeneity about what the 19 different members of the committee think right now is likely to be the appropriate short-term interest rate a year from now. Right? There are some folks who say, oh, hey, we shouldn't have even gone down that 25. I still think it would be appropriate to stay here at 375 to 4. There are folks who say the current rate is fine, right? And then you've got people dribbling down, and even someone who says, oh yeah, we should be, here down around 2 to 2.25 at the end of next year. So you're seeing a lot of heterogeneity of thought, and that's backed up by the outlooks for the economy, what they think the drivers are. Some of them could well be differences in baseline forecast. So I asked you at the beginning, do you think growth is going to slow? Do you think it's going to expand? All those kinds of things. We forecast in and we have baselines. Some of it could be differences in baseline forecasts. A lot of it, my suspicion from hearing people talk in the public, is that a lot of it has to do with risks. And if you watch the chair's press conference, you will have heard that as well. So folks are also trying to say, well, I don't necessarily have a huge degree of confidence in any particular forecast, but as I think about those risks that we just talked about, which one would I like to take on board more than another? Now, over the last 6 months, this got even more complicated, right? Because before the FOMC started cutting rates, you could have this discussion. You could say rates have been here, they've been here for a while. Which of these risks is the one I'm more worried about? Okay, let me shade a little bit in that direction, right? If you're worried about labor, maybe you think about a cut, and that would be from a risk management point of view. If you're worried more about the inflation, you might want to stay. Well, they've made cuts now. And so now as you make cuts, you also have to fold in, well, all right, what is going to be the impact of those cuts on the things that I'm worried about and the risks about the things that I'm worried about? And so you're starting to see, like here, a large degree of spread across all these folks, right? So, again, the uncertainty about the future path of interest rates is probably part of what we need to think about going into 2026. So this is where I'm going to end. I will do a short segue into Fed independence, and I usually say this anyway when I put up the dot plot, but I think this week and in this particular time, it's super helpful to look at those dots and see those as individual decision makers with input into the process. So again, at any given time, 12 of them are voting. The other folks are rotating through, but everyone is a full participant in that conversation. So what you're seeing here is a huge amount of heterogeneity and differences of opinion that help ultimately drive what the decision that the committee makes is. So part of what you're seeing here is the independence of the Federal Reserve System, right? These dots, the 7 governors have staff in Washington, but the other 12 dots, they got us in 12 different banks around the country doing our best to try to sort through the questions that we just talked to you about. And quite frankly, coming to not necessarily different conclusions, but different weightings and different risk tolerances. And every one of those principles is wearing a very heavy responsibility to work through this situation. So I want to put that out there and say, to me, this is a great example of how the system is set up and how it works, even if maybe for financial markets, it doesn't provide sort of the guidance and the forward-looking certainty that is comfortable for all of us. It does tell you that there's a lot going on here and a lot of opinions being traded back and forth in order to hit that dual mandate, which is everyone's goal. So with that, I will stop and see what kind of questions you have.